Welcome back to Geoeconomic Summit. I'm Yuichi Hosoya. As is introduced before, I'm a group head of Europe-Asia group within the IOG and also the research director within the API. In this session, panel discussion 2, we will focus perhaps one of the most difficult and important agendas of which we are now facing, that is the weaponized economics. Maybe in this room, many people are familiar with this concept, the weaponized economics. Unlike before, global economy has been transformed into a different system, and in which we, or each country, need to respond to this difficult question, weaponized economics. This is a very important but difficult question, but fortunately in this session, we have two truly distinguished speaker panelists. So let me introduce briefly two speakers. The first one is Professor Taeho. Professor Taeho is currently president of Seoul Forum for International Affairs, and also Professor Emeritus at the Seoul National University. But beforehand, between 2011 and 2013, he was a Minister for Trade of the Korean government. But including this, he led many negotiations, trade negotiations within the Korean government. And then the second speaker is Professor Paolo Magri. Professor Magri is perhaps one of the most distinguished and famous scholars of international politics, and currently he's a president of the advisory board of the ISPI, Italian Institute for International Political Studies, perhaps the most famous or one of the most famous think tanks in Italy. At the same time, he is professor of international relations at Bocconi University, very famous university in Italy. And in this session, we will focus, as I mentioned, at this difficult question of the weaponized economics. Korea, Europe, Japan all face this difficult question. Unlike before, we now face two giants who tend to weaponize economic interdependent relations. One is our common ally, of course, the United States. And the other one is basically our biggest trading partner, China. So we cannot deny or ignore these two giants. Of course, we need to maintain good relationship with both of them. But at the same time, they're presenting quite different kinds of trade policy, which we are not quite familiar with. So we need to have new strategy. We need to have a new understanding of the current situation. So that, let me ask in the beginning one question to panelists. The question is, how do you two observe Korean and European geoeconomic strategy in response to this weaponized economics in the current changing global order? From the point of view, we need to learn from our like-minded partners of how our like-minded partners are responding to these challenges, or how these countries are formulating their own strategy responding to these challenges. So first, may I ask Professor Bach to present your view on Korean strategy and how Korea has been responding to these challenges?
So for my initial remarks,
I will use
the podium.
Please.
I didn't prepare the slide. It's much better for me to read from the podium. That's why I'm using this podium. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute of Geoeconomics for inviting me to this very prestigious gathering. I would also like to thank Professor Hosoya for the kind introduction. As Professor Hosoya mentioned this afternoon, I would like to briefly share my thoughts on how Korea has responded to weaponized economics, as well as a short of my thinking on the future of global trade order. Maybe we can discuss this later. Let me begin with Korea's response to weaponized economics. There's a Korean proverb, a shrimp's back breaks in a fight between whales. This is our traditional proverb. For decades, Korea, a mid-sized economy, has feared being squeezed between the United States and China. But today, I can argue maybe the shrimp has learned how to navigate and perhaps even steer. Well, Korea's experience with weaponized economics is not theoretical or not abstract. It's real, recent, and instructive. As you know, Korea is in a very difficult yet important position in the global economy. Korea is a trade-dependent economy with exports accounting for roughly 40% of its GDP. And Korea is also a key player in global supply chain in semiconductor, batteries, shipbuilding, and steel. Korea has a foundational security alliance with the United States, yet China remains Korea's largest trading partner. This exposure is not abstract. Let me give you one concrete example which happened in the past. In 2016, when Korea agreed with the United States to deploy kind of technical word THAAD missile defense system, China responded with a wave of unofficial economic retaliation. Chinese group tour to Korea virtually stopped in next year, in 2017. K-pop performance were pulled from Chinese media. Approvals for Korean online video games were halted. Lotte, the company that provided the land for THAAD missiles, eventually had to withdraw its retail business from China entirely. The third case was the moment Korea learned very directly that economic interdependence can be weaponized. Let me share three lessons that have shaped Korea's response. First, supply chain sovereignty requires proactive investment, not reactive policy. Korea has moved deliberately to diversify away from single source dependencies in critical minerals, materials, and key manufacturing components. Korea is currently participating in the Minerals Security Partnership and considering joining the US-led agreement on trade in critical minerals. In addition, Korea is engaged in discussions with the European Union and Japan to strengthen cooperation on critical minerals. Korean firms have also invested heavily in domestic semiconductor and battery factories. Korea has learned that economic security is not a quick fix. It requires long-term investment in the country's fundamental structure. Second lesson, multilateral framework matter, but they must be built before the crisis, not during it. Korea has been an active participant in the CHIP4 alliance, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and various supply chain dialogues. None of these are perfect. However, they have helped Korea have a voice when important rules are being made on export controls, on critical minerals, and on digital trade. Nations that engage early in shaping the architecture of economic security have far more influence than those that simply react to it. Thirdly, our export model itself is evolving. In 2025, Korea's exports surpassed $700 billion for the first time, with export to the United States reaching $123 billion despite the difficult tariff environment. More than 70% of those exports are now intermediate goods, materials, parts, and equipment, much of it flowing to overseas affiliates of Korean firms. The correlation between Korea's outward direct investment and its intermediate goods export is now more than 0.94. Korea's strategy going forward is to deepen this model. In other words, to expand exports linked to overseas investment, particularly by supplying high value-added inputs to global operations. This will sustain export growth while keeping high-quality jobs at home. I should add that this strategy is also being tested by our most important partner. At the APEC leaders meeting held in Korea last October, Korea agreed with the United States to invest $20 billion annually over the 10 years period in the US designated project, plus an additional $150 billion for the reconstruction of US shipbuilding. These agreements with the United States were made in exchange for reducing US reciprocal tariffs on Korean goods from 25 to 15%. The Korean-US Free Trade Agreement, which had been in force since 2012, making over 98% of bilateral trade tariff-free, was effectively nullified overnight. The Korean government is currently working closely with the Korean firms to ensure that these investments I just mentioned are mutually beneficial to both United States and Korea. Nonetheless, Korean companies considering investing in the United States at Washington's request raised several concerns, including high tariffs on intermediate goods to be imported from Korea for their US manufacturing operations, as well as uncertainty regarding visas for Korean personnel working at the US manufacturing site. We are working through these challenges, but they illustrate how even alliance relationships are being reshaped by economic statecraft. This brings me to a broader point. Professor Hosoya mentioned that this is a topic we can discuss later, but I will say something about this. Tariffs, subsidies, industrial policies are no longer the preserve of developing economies. They have become mainstream instrument of statecraft, including among allies. The fundamental question is this: how do we maintain solidarity among like-minded nations when economic competition is intensifying within that very group? I took Prime Minister Mark Carney's call at Davos this year for middle powers like Canada, Japan, Korea to act together very seriously. But I think we should be realistic. Creating an entirely new middle power bloc for sensitive trade issues would be extremely difficult. The more practical path is to achieve use of the institutions we already have. In this context, the CPTPP in particular will become increasingly important since it is comprehensive and highly liberalizing, and also the United Kingdom has joined. Korea is pursuing accession. I was wondering if European Union to seriously consider joining the CPTPP as well, which would further strengthen its role in the global trading system. In the first session, Mr. Novo, you mentioned that. I totally agree with you. I think we are sharing the same kind of position. But it may be difficult. The EU as a whole can join the CPTPP, but maybe individual countries. In addition, the WTO should allow for more flexible and inclusive plurilateral agreements in areas such as overcapacity, economic security, supply chain, investment facilitation, things like that. Rather than strictly adhering to consensus-based decision-making that yields virtually little progress, it may be more practical to allow limited MFN exceptions if they contribute to stabilizing and improving the global trading system. Let me conclude. Korea is not a great power, but Korea is a technologically advanced, strategically located, alliance-embedded democracy that has had no choice but to develop sophisticated responses to the weaponized economics, from THAAD to semiconductor controls to tariff negotiations. Challenge before all of us is not simply to survive the era of weaponized economics, it is to shape it so that economic security and an open international trade order remains compatible, not contradictory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Buck, for sharing your view on how Korea has been responding to the challenges relating to weaponized economics. As you mentioned, of course, Japan and Korea are not like United States or China. But at the same time, I feel that Korea is a really, really pivotal, important player in the field of the global trade. So we cannot exclude nor ignore the important role that Korea is now playing. Of course, Europe is another key player, central player in the global trade. And Europe has been occupying a special place in the global trade. And I think that at the same time, the European Union has been defining and deciding the direction of global economy. Of course, Italy is one of the important players within the EU. Particularly today, I think Italian role becomes further more important because of the leadership of your prime minister, because of the close relationship of your prime ministers with President Donald Trump. So I'm really looking forward to have your wisdom on how Europe, Italy has been responding to this challenge.
I'm sorry I will disappoint you, but as a rule, when abroad, I only talk about Italy if you ask me about soccer. When I talk in panel, I talk about Europe. Today, I'm lucky enough because I will have only preliminary remarks on Europe because the real speaker on Europe will be soon Carl Bildt, which will be in the next session. So I will share some comment. But let me start with my personal little story, little experience on how I felt the world has gradually moved from the age of economics to the age of geoeconomics, to the age of weaponized economy. As Carl knows, my hometown in Italy is Bergamo. It's 50 kilometers from Milano, but it's important, relevant, because unfortunately, it was the epicenter of the COVID pandemic in 2020. Yes, of course, after Wuhan, but only a couple of weeks after Wuhan. So we were the epicenter, immediately after Wuhan, facing the challenges of no mask, no ventilators, no equipment, no, of course, no vaccines. Because after decades of optimistic age of economics, the age of just-in-time, the age of the cheapest, the best, everything we needed was produced far away. Vietnam, China, or many other places. But luckily, we were the first, still living in the age of more or less united we stand, of solidarity. So we were in need and we received help from Japan, I remember the Nippon Foundation and others, but even at the same time, in the same moment, from Russia, China, and a little bit less, because Trump was already there, from United States. A lot of propaganda. I remember I was shocked to see, because the Russians sent soldiers to deliver equipment. So at the airport, small airport of my city, we had Russian soldiers in uniform delivering goods to us. And then Chinese with the flag and the big plane, but all delivering aids. Then COVID spread everywhere and fear spread everywhere. And we moved into a temporary every man for himself world, in which everyone was protecting himself, keep introducing export control, competing when the vaccine arrived with vaccine, and protecting their own population. That was temporary. Then came Ukraine, then came US-China tension, trade tension and tariff, then Iran, and we increasingly moved into the free-for-all world, the jungle, what's mentioned by a speaker before me, in which we have moved into a systemic weaponization of the economy, systemic fear, and systemic need of protection on defense, on trade, on technology, on energy, on commodity. Now, what about Europe? How does Europe fit into this picture of reacting to this weaponized economy? There is some time prevailing or diffuse narrative abroad, sometimes even in Italy, which describes Europe as the designated victim. You know, there is a movie cycle, Designated Survivor, and we are described as the designated victim of this weaponized economy. Why? Because in an age in which national interest gets merged with the economy, geoeconomic is that. National interest, we are not a nation. In an age in which defense becomes relevant, we are peace lover. Trump will say we are free riders in defense, so we have a problem. In the age in which quick and fast is crucial, we are a slow motion group of countries. Let me now reflect on how this narrative is correct. By the way, sometimes it's not in this case, but sometimes it's quite bizarre. I was recently invited in a couple of meetings abroad in which the original title of the session was Europe Les Miserables, and another one was Europe Is the Sunset Arriving? And of course, me and the other panelists asked the title to be changed, otherwise we would not participate. But let's try to comment briefly on how we are reacting without being triumphalistic, but trying to be realistic. Because Europe's response is not revolutionary, but it is no longer naive. It's clearly responding to this new world, is clearly a challenge, as it is, as was mentioned by my colleague from Korea, as it is for the other countries. Having said that, I will try to read Europe's reaction through 4 variables. How aware we are that the world is changed, how much political will do we have to react, do we have time on our side, and do we have money to react, to do what is required to react. On awareness, I'm extremely positive. The change is very clear. Everything that has happened has forced strategic awakening, and which has materialized in 3 reports, the Nihisto, the Draghi, and the Letta report. On the second point, political will, I'm still very positive. We have moved from declaration to instruments, Repower Europe, the Critical Raw Material Act, the CHIP Act, the Anti-Coercion Instrument, Defense Initiative, cybersecurity rules. We also moved from awareness to money, but the scale is still an issue. The Draghi report spoke of approximately 800 billion. Updated estimates talk about more than 1 trillion, and existing tools, we have to be realistic, are not there yet. And on time, on some measure, we are in the short run, so meaning they are being implemented and we can expect results in a few years. On other, in our country, like in other places, we need more time, meaning from 8 to 15 years to become really autonomous. But let me now explore briefly three areas utilizing these four variables. The third one is energy. In energy, after 2022, we have learned that chip dependence it's the past, and we are learning it again in this year. And with the program Repower Europe, we have designed a new phase of our energy policy, mobilizing significant resources, more than approximately 100 billion. So we are very good in awareness. We are extremely good on political will. We have plans for the short run, but on money, we are not there, because what is needed is approximately 4 times what is available right now. And there is a huge question mark on Hormuz, of course, because on one side, it's increased awareness and the will to move fast, but on the other side, money, we are now currently utilizing our money to pay for subsidies and not to change our sources in the long term. The second area, briefly, is on critical minerals and rare earths. We have recognized the high dependence on China, and the Critical Raw Material Act has clearly set 2030 targets. At least 10% of consumption extracted in Europe, 40% processed in Europe, 25% from recycling. This is clearly the right direction, but time is crucial here. Timeline, it matters. Mines, refining capacity, and recycling chains takes years, while coercion can, as you all know, can happen overnight. So on rare earth, we are very good in awareness, very good on political will. We have money, but time is crucial. We need, in some cases, 10 to 12 years, and we may not have 10, 12 years. On defense, last area. Here, the change is dramatic. EU member states' defense spending actually doubled from 2020 in 2025. Defense investment increased 40%. And this figure clearly shows political will and money. But Europe still has fragmentation, duplication, and dependence on non-European technology. We already have a budget which is twice the Russian budget and more than China, but we lack coordination of investment and spending. So we have an issue here which is time, coordination, and time is crucial, because if we want to move fast, we will increase dependency from America, or rather supplier. If we want to be independent, we may be slow. So what is the final assessment? The final assessment is that designated victim is not sleeping. Awareness is high. Political will is stronger than before. But we still have, as many other, a problem with money, especially in energy security, a problem with time in critical materials, a problem in coordination in defense. The European answer is therefore neither catastrophic nor triumphalistic. We are facing, as others, 2 tests. The first test, very important, is whether we can become autonomous without becoming inward-looking. And the second test is whether we are able to transform a crisis in an opportunity, without being rhetorical on this expression, or if a crisis becomes a distraction. Crisis as an opportunity is because a crisis increases our awareness and willingness to move. The crisis as a distraction is the crisis where divert money from long-term plan to short-term reaction. So our challenge is, as we are not the only one facing it, is to protect without closing. partnering you mentioned with other countries, middle power countries in the world, Japan, Korea, and Canada, and many other. Our goal is, Europe goal is to build up a credible resilience, open when possible, protected when necessary, and much faster than in the past. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Magri, for sharing your view on how Europe has been responding to this question, while mentioning about the realistic problems that Europe, of course, not just Europe, but both Japan and Korea as well, are now facing, like the necessity of money, for sufficient financial resources, the necessity of time and the importance of timeline, particularly when we think about the rare earths. In the beginning of your remarks, you mentioned about Italy. And in the world of football, Italy has been always a superpower. But even superpower is defeated by smaller powers. And that
I should have said tennis. You know, I was stupid. I mentioned soccer at a time in which Italy should. I could not even talk about soccer on Italy. So I was mentioning tennis. Sinner.
Okay, but well, that reminds me of the importance lesson, because even superpower can be defeated by smaller power, and that can be a good lesson to the current superpowers in the international politics, like, of course, United States and China. So we cannot see the future, and that means that even though we know that there are two giants, United States and China, but if middle powers can collaborate more deeply and effectively, maybe that coalition can define the future framework of the world. And of course, Europe, Japan, Korea, and Canada, together with some other like-minded partners, maybe we can define the future. But beforehand, we need to coordinate differences, because there are so many differences, barriers. And at the same time, as I mentioned in the beginning, we cannot exclude the United States nor China. Of course, particularly United States, because United States is our valuable ally. And there are many good peoples. There are many good Americans, as we see in this room. And of course, we really hope to continue to strengthen our ties with not just good Americans, but maybe with some bad Americans. Because, well, good Americans because they are our friends. But at the same time, well, our interests define the future foreign relations. And our interests rise in the United States. So at least we cannot reject the importance of our alliance relationship with the United States. But at the same time, as I mentioned, it is essential, first of all, to respond to the current challenges first, and then also it is essential because Japan, European countries, Korea as well, we are weaker than those giants. We need to have a better strategy to respond to these challenges. In the beginning of this session, I forgot to mention about what weaponized economics is. Of course, many of the audience in this room might be familiar with the concept because, of course, there are so many experts, senior officials, business leaders. They are really, really familiar with many up-to-date international trends. But let me briefly describe what this weaponized economics is. Weaponized economics is generally defined as, the use of economic tools as instruments of political power to pressure, punish, influence, or constrain another country company or group, instead of using military force, governments, and sometimes large organizations use economic leverage. This definition is given by ChatGPT. Currently, professors, academics need to confess when we used ChatGPT or those AI, that we use it. But not just that, last year, two leading scholars in this field, Henry Farrell and also Abraham Newman, wrote an important article to the Foreign Affairs magazines entitled The Weaponized World Economy. And they wrote about the true opening of the age of weaponized interdependence, as you mentioned, the age of geoeconomics, the age of weaponized economics come. And in their article, they also wrote that the new era will be shaped by weapons of economic and technological coercion, sanctions, and supply chain attacks, and export measures that repurpose the main points of control in the infrastructure that underpins the interdependent global economy, unquote. So more and more scholars tend to use the concept of the weaponized economics to describe current situation of the global economy. And we already discussed on that. The next thing is how to respond to this together. And as is already mentioned by two distinguished panelists, it is essential to coordinate our differences, to coordinate our strategies, to create a deeper cooperation and also a much stronger coalition to tackle these issues. So the next question to you, to panelists, is how would you think about the creation of much more effective coalition among like-minded middle powers or liberal democracies, of course. Europe, Japan, and also Korea. These are leading liberal democracies in the world. So we shouldn't be just bystanding by seeing these events, but we need to be a shaper of the events. To shape the events, we need to have much deeper, much more effective cooperation. So let me ask you too on how we can create much better coalition and what is necessary for us to create much stronger coalition. And Professor Bakunis already mentioned about the possibility of combining EU with the CPTPP. And I'm curious about how and when and whether the Korea enters the CPTPP, and the current close cooperation between two leaders, Japan and Korea, can be seen as a good signal to have much closer tie. Of course, EU and Japan are creating much stronger ties. So let me ask you too to share your wisdom on how we can create much more effective coalition, as Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, mentioned the beginning of this year. So Professor Berg.
Yes, thank you, Professor Hosoya. Even though somebody mentioned that that kind of middle power countries coalition is maybe academically naive thinking, in reality it's very, very difficult to do that. To some extent, I agree with them, because if you go back to the history of multilateral trading negotiations, I think it was the Tokyo round in the 70s. They really talk about many important issues, like government procurement, subsidies, meat, aircraft, and all kind of things. But the participating country cannot agree upon anything. So we finished the tariff negotiations, but so-called non-tariff 8 areas, we cannot finish. So we allow the participant to make a plurilateral agreement we call code. Among the countries who signed the code, they will actually leap to the agreement, which is really against the multilateral trading system. That's why the Uruguay round in the 80s, they imposed a very important principle, single undertaking. In other words, everything must be completed. Otherwise, we cannot complete anything. So that's difficult to have a plurilateral agreement. So now if some countries want to do something, then as a WTO member, some other countries say, no, we cannot do that. Then we can repeat this kind of problem forever. So it's time for WTO members to think about more flexible. That's why I mentioned that maybe temporarily exempting MFN principle to certain issues, then we can make some kind of progress. So, but who will take this issue to the WTO? It's very, very difficult. Actually, I think last year, December and early January, United States actually submitted a proposal in a long time, that they need a reform of the WTO, especially subsidies in other areas. So maybe U.S. will gradually coming to the WTO, and also maybe they can push for more plurilateral, something like that. We have to see, but awfully difficult. That's why I mentioned CPTPP, which is very high level. This is allowed legally by the WTO, Regional Trade Agreement. So maybe if you expand members. Regarding Korea's membership of CPTPP, it has been discussing for a long, long time. Even when I was a minister, 2013, US suggested we should join the TPP at that time, but we were busy in negotiating our FTA with China. That's why we skipped this opportunity. Right now, we are almost ready, but our subcommittee of our National Assembly must receive the report. The report is already there. This special committee should listen to the report and then allow the government to submit the application. Only we have that kind of steps are left, but since domestic politics on other areas, our government is not pushing yet. But sooner or later, we have a June 3rd, our local government election. After June 3rd, maybe our government will try to submit the application. Then we'll negotiate with Japan and other countries. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for the great news. So how about Professor?
No, clearly, dialogue and cooperation among middle power or countries is important and crucial. But first, let's be realistic. In many countries, fear prevails, fear to get someone upset. And so you have double approaches. So we should become more independent, but then try at the same time, still try to please the White House, the current leader of the White House, first. Second, I think that it's good to cooperate and to create alternative, but the main focus of this cooperation should be to let the Americans understand that they have to come back. Because what's happening is scaring. My cleaning lady, I was going to TV for a program 2 weeks ago. She told me, but why don't you go on TV and say that we should leave the United States on their own and have an agreement with Russia and China? But this, you say, why do I talk about my cleaning lady? No, because this is exactly what polls with European and Asian say, that United States is considered to be a risk for peace in the world, a challenge, more than Putin. Xi Jinping is even considered to be a contributor to peace, okay? So the main coalition, the main goal with hope of the coalition is to hold on and try to convince the Americans, not the American, that they have to come back. I'm not saying this is easy. I heard the previous speech saying that this will not change, and maybe he is right. But it's clear to everyone that there is no better alternative partnership for us than the United States, and no better partnership for the United States than us. So we have to work on that. And my last point is that we have to work together in sharing the view that an excess of we can die of an excess of protection. So if everyone, like in the 70s with the excess of deterrence, we're bringing the war towards a nuclear war, if everyone protects himself, the world becomes a more dangerous world, economically, politically, military. It's like when you go into a restaurant, you enter a noisy restaurant and you sit at your table, and what do? You raise your voice. But if everyone in the table raise their voice, the noise becomes worse. So it's a terrible cycle, and we have to work with partners like-minded to react now, to send message now, but having in mind that the long term is made by a world in which we have a dialogue with the Americans, and in which we are sober in protecting ourselves, because too much protection is not helpful and not wise. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. You two are generally regarded as wise men in your own country or globally, and your answers to my questions actually gave us a really, really clear understanding about what we should do. And there are several levels. At the universal level, like United Nations and the WTO, these institutions are in trouble. Then there are regional level, like EU. In Asia, there are several regional frameworks, but sometimes regional solutions itself brings some difficult problem. Then there is a level of coalition among the like-minded partners approach. And this approach is proposed by, like as mentioned, Prime Minister Mike Carney of Canada. And also, in each country, we need to have national strategy to respond to these challenges, to defend our own interests. So there are several different levels, different approaches. And the necessary thing is that we need to combine all of these approaches to defend our own interests. Otherwise, we will be damaged by the turbulence in global politics. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to two excellent panelists, as well as thanks to many, many good questions and comments from the floor. We could have a wonderful discussion. By thanking to panelists, I'd like to close this session. Thank you very much indeed.